Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we're going to get started. Thanks for being patient. We gave a couple extra minutes today because I know it's really hard to get around town this morning. So thanks for plodding through the traffic and making your way here. We are very pleased to be hosting this morning a presentation of findings of a really interesting study and handbook that has been put together by the U.S. Department of Energy, Power Africa, the U.S. Energy Association, and a large group, which you'll hear a little bit about in a bit, of experts. And the handbook is really designed to help exporting or importing countries who are interested in getting into the LNG market to really understand what that's about. And not really prescribe a solution necessarily, but help them understand the component pieces of what goes into making that market possible. And so we're really pleased to have this discussion today because we've not only had a huge number of conversations over the last year or so on the ongoing evolution of our understanding of LNG markets, what's the art of the possible, what are some of the roadblocks, but we've also spent a good amount of time with our Africa program here, Jennifer Cooke, who's the director of that Africa program, looking at Power Africa and some of the issues of energy development in that region. And so Jennifer's going to talk a little bit about that work that we did. But we are just very pleased because it brings together a number of streams of research and thinking that we've been doing here at CSIS, and is a really cool resource, both in how it was put together and what it does and what it hopes to do, that we're very pleased to make available to all of you here, but also to all of the people who are watching internationally and use some of these studies as resources as they grapple with their energy challenges. So we will have presentations by Assistant Secretary Chris Smith, who is the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy, one of his last effective days on the job, and we've just really enjoyed working with Chris over the years, and as we do with all civil servants, applaud him for his government service and thank him very much for that time. So very pleased to have Chris here again to talk about this project. We're also then hear from Deputy Coordinator Sean Jones from Power Africa at the USAID. We've had Power Africa in a number of times over the years and been really pleased to track your progress and hear about all the good things that you're doing. And then Angelina LaRose, who is the head of Integrated International Analysis at the Energy Information Administration, who's also been here before, so we really appreciate having you back as well. And then finally, some comments, as I said, from Jennifer Cooke, who directs the Africa program here at CSIS, and we're very pleased to co-sponsor this event with today. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Chris to get us started. And I don't know if you brought a copy of the book, so I'm going to do this for you in advance. This is the actual handbook itself, but it is available online as well that you can take a look at it. So Chris, come on.
So thank you so much, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and it's great to be here at CSIS actually this will be the last public event that I get to do in this job. So it's a pleasure to be back here, and thanks for giving us this venue to talk about what I think is a really important engagement that we've had in collaboration with Power Africa. So this is part of the Understanding series that Power Africa has put forth. There's been a couple of tomes that Power Africa has written that looks at power purchase agreements and other areas. So what we wanted to do was expand on that as part of the Power Africa initiative and look at liquefied natural gas and LNG options and options for natural gas. And what I wanted to do, take a few minutes here today, was talk about the genesis behind the efforts, what we're trying to accomplish, some important goals I think we have together between the Department of Energy and Power Africa, and some of the conclusions of the work that we've done around LNG and LNG opportunities. So as everyone here is aware, the relationship between the United States and Africa has been an important priority for President Obama. He at one point committed 3 of his cabinet secretaries to making high-level trips to the continent. Secretary Liu took a high-level delegation, as did Secretary Pritzker. And I had the privilege of joining Secretary Moniz when we went to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in June of 2014 for the U.S.-Africa Energy Ministerial. And this was the first high-level engagement that we had between the United States and African governments for many years. We had it there at the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia. We had high-level delegations, ministerial-level delegations from 40 countries and from entities around the continent. So one thing that we really saw in those meetings, and I had the privilege of sitting with Secretary Moniz as he met with his counterparts and ministers from throughout the continent, was there was a huge interest and I think a pent-up demand for this high-level engagement between the United States and Africa throughout the continent. There's a lot of really good work, I think, for us to do on a government-to-government basis to create opportunities for the private sector to make investments throughout the continent. One theme that came through all those discussions really was that as we look at our relationships between the United States and the governments throughout the region, we're shifting from this idea of support and aid really to a new philosophy of business partnerships. Because as we see growing economies, as we see economies that are becoming more sophisticated in the way they think about regulatory reform, you're seeing big opportunities, I think, to grow, to invest, and in doing that, to increase the quality of life for people throughout the continent and help, I think, the entire world in terms of issues of energy security. So as part of this, the Secretary created Energy Africa Task Force, which I co-chaired, or I have co-chaired during my time at DOE. And one of the initial things that we decided to do was to push this idea of having a handbook that looks at kind of a guidebook for how we think about developing LNG opportunities. So in order to start the process, we had a couple of high-level sessions, which we invited subject matter experts from multidisciplinary subject matter experts to talk about issues from oil and gas companies, from law firms, from engineering and contracting firms, from host governments. So we had two initial sessions, one in London and one in Houston. So the first Houston session, we co-sponsored with the Baker Institute there at Rice University. That was in May of 2016. And in that session, what we wanted to do is really talk about the business models that one would use to build these projects. And this is a moving playing field. As you look at the mega projects that have gone forward from, when I was at Chevron, I had the opportunity to work on the Gorgon project for many years, which has finally got to final investment decision and operation there. And that goes all the way through the emerging business models that we have here in the United States with shale gas being converted into LNG for export. So we wanted to talk about, what are the major components, who are the main actors from the builders of the plant to the investors in the upstream, how they link back to the market, and how do these evolving models being executed from an integrated model in which you've got one ring fence around the entire development activity through emerging merchant models, through something that looks more like a tolling model, which you're seeing with the US-based organizations that are looking at exporting LNG. The challenge that governments have is that, as you're the minister in whatever country and you're thinking about, well, how do I best access and develop the resources in my country for the benefit of the people who live here and attract investment? You've got senior civil servants who are thinking about making these decisions, the political leadership in the country, supported by good staff of public servants. And on the other side of the table are very well-staffed teams from London or Houston who know exactly what they want, have built many of these projects. And our challenge is, well, how do we create the right type of capacity building? How do we work together with our friends and allies in governments throughout Africa to build the type of governmental capacity so that you can actually make good decisions, attract investments, and get projects to final investment decision? So our goal is not to promote any particular business model. It's not to say, well, here's how you do it, and here's how you don't do it. The goal here is to say, well, what is a framework that you can think through? Like, what are the options? How do you make sure that you're using common vocabulary as you think about how you can make these decisions? And how do you structure those conversations such that you can get to the point of having the confidence to make the right type of decision that will attract those investments? So that was the first session that we did in Houston. The following one we did in Imperial College in London in June of last year. That should be 2016, actually. And so what we looked at in that session was, in the first session we looked at, well, here are the business models and how do we describe the business models from integrated through tolling model. In this session that we did in London, the idea was to say, well, what are the factors that you as a government should be considering so that you can evaluate the different business models that might be presented in front of you that you're considering? How do you think about issues of partner alignment? How do you think about issues of financeability, and what does that really mean? How do you look at issues of complexity? A simpler versus a more complex business structure will create different requirements for the government in terms of regulatory sophistication to understand, manage, and regulate that project. So how do you consider that? As a host government, how do you think about issues of marketability? I mean, do you have one entity that markets gas from your country that is marketed as one product, or do you have many entities that are looking at a tolling model that might be marketing that gas in different ways that might create different types of value? How do you think about issues of timing, of costs, of emerging technologies? So this session was not to say, well, here are the different business models. This was to say, what are the lenses you would look through to evaluate something that you have being in place in front of you? So this was the focus of the second session. And the third and fourth sessions we did here in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. And the goal here was to say, well, here are some initial thoughts that we've had from consulting with these subject matter experts who've built projects, who've financed projects, who've done the commercial structures on projects, who've built the sales and purchase agreements. So here's what we've learned. Here's some initial thoughts. And how do we structure this into a product that's actually going to be useful to you as a decision maker in Tanzania or in Mozambique or in Madagascar? How do we make sure that the product that we are working on is going to be useful for you in terms of your decision-making process? And so we had two events. One was managed by USEA, in which we invited embassies throughout here in Washington, D.C. to come and talk to us about our process. And the second was up in Columbia University on the shoulders of the UN General Assembly, in which we had the minister from Shibuya from Ghana participated. We had the principal secretary, Andrew Kamo from Kenya participated in that session, and subject matter experts from South Africa and other countries. So that was really to make sure that as we think about this challenge, that this is really a product that's not dreamed up here and executed here, but it's really a collaborative partnership with our allies and trading partners throughout the region. And then that led to what we'll refer to as the book sprint process. So this is a process that has been used before in Power Africa products. And the idea is that you take your initial work, in which you frame the opportunity, you use that as some of your source material, and then you go out and you bring in subject matter experts to, in a short period of time, take those ideas, frame them, shape them, come up with the right outline, and actually write a product so that at the end of the week, you have in your hand a draft that looks pretty close to the final, and you put that straight up, and that's your discussion draft. It keeps the project from just rolling and rolling and rolling on forever. It forces you to come to a conclusion point. And so the idea here was that we're going to go out and we are going to bring in the foremost subject matter experts on building projects, who've built big projects, of pushing projects to FID, of doing the financing. We're going to get some of the best law firms to participate. We're going to have host governments send their senior officials to come in and help shape this process. And we're going to get everybody to come to kind of an undisclosed location that's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, so you can't get away, and you're going to be kind of trapped there for a week. And everybody's going to do this for free, and they're going to donate their time, and they're going to be here for a week, and they're going to come out of this process with a book. And amazingly enough, it has worked pretty well. I mean, I'll say that the team actually did a terrific job of explaining the value of this, of saying here's an important collaboration between the United States and other governments. Here's an effort that's going to help U.S. projects and projects from around the world get to final investment decision throughout the continent, and that there's something worthwhile here to do. So here's the, here are the participants that wrote the book, essentially. And how the process works is, you get together in a room, and they told us before we started, they said, don't show up with your outline, because, I kind of knew what I thought the outline of the book was going to be, and they said, well, just keep that to yourself. Have the people come, and we're going to discuss, how we, what is important, and what we should dig into, and how we structure the document. So here are the participants. And I just want to highlight here the participants who came from the continent to Maryland to participate directly. So we were really shooting for a kind of 50-50 split between subject matter experts that came from upstream companies and law firms and consultancies and EPC firms here in the United States, and senior officials that are coming from Nigeria and from Ghana and from Mozambique and from Tanzania. And so this is a slide just to highlight the split, that this, in order for this to work, in order for this to be effective, it really needs to be a product that is built in collaboration between companies here and officials throughout the continent. So here's just a shot of some of the deliberations. I was there for the beginning, so I kind of got to do the opening framing, and I was there for the first morning. And you never really know how these things are going to work and get a bunch of smart people around the table, and how do you get the ball rolling, get people to talk. But we had the opposite problem. I was there for the initial storming, and there was a facilitator there who does these book sprints. And her biggest challenge was just to get the microphone away from people, because people had very, very strong views about this is what's important, right? This is what we need to focus on. Is it, here's what we need to focus on partner alignment or financing or marketability. And there were very, very strong views amongst this group. And we've got a draft, which hopefully we have copies here that you guys can take back with you. But here's the actual book, right? And the nature of the process is that these are living documents. This process was finished. We got a draft up on the web, so you can download this product right now. There'll be subsequent efforts to shape and polish and get feedback on the draft that we have up right now. So there'll be future revisions, but this is up and available right now. And here's the table of contents that gives you an idea of what the book contains. And here's another way of thinking about the table of contents. And these, I've just taken the main topics here within the book and put them into categories of what we're trying to address. So for something as complex as thinking about how do you develop an LNG project from upstream exploration production all the way through marketing, a comprehensive book would be, multiple volumes. It would be a voluminous undertaking. So what we wanted to do here was to shape the primary questions that you would have to ask as a public servant when you're thinking about, how do I make a decision that's going to lead to a company spending, billions of dollars here in our country, and it's going to lead to the commercialization of something as important as the natural resources, which are the sovereign possession of that country. So what are the big questions that we have to ask? So here's how we've tried to frame this. What's the overall market condition of the world, what's happening in the world, what do global gas markets look like? What are some options for structuring an LNG project? And a very specific goal that we had in the way that we've written this is not to say this structure is better than that structure, or you should be integrated, or you should be merchant, or you should be tolling, or you should have some hybrid form. It's to shape those options so that there's a kind of common vocabulary between the companies that are making the proposals and the governments that have to make the decisions. How do project decisions impact the host country? So everything from environmental issues to local content. How do you create jobs within the host country in a way that benefits the project and benefits the country and pushes the investment forward? How do you make sure that there's gas that goes to the domestic market, which is the important hook back to Power Africa? How do you make sure that gas is not only creating foreign revenue that comes to the country, but it's also benefiting power generation. It's benefiting industrial growth within the country. And importantly, what does the host government have to do? What's the government role in pushing these projects forward? And what needs to happen going forward in capacity building, which is really the next step of workshops and collaborations that this effort is going to shape. The capacity building is incredibly important, and this is something that it's a challenge for every government. I think back on our own experience here in the United States in the time that I've been at the Department of Energy. We're primarily a scientific organization. We do the research and development and some policy work, but we're also the regulators for natural gas, and we have shifted from importing natural gas to exporting just over the short period that I've been the Assistant Secretary here at the Department of Energy. And so we had to take the Natural Gas Act, which was written and passed by Congress, which gives a framework for how you think about gas trade, and apply that framework to an entirely new activity, which now is exporting natural gas. And so I signed those orders. So all the orders that the country has issued has been written by the team right here in front of me, and signed by me. And we were in a similar situation here, where companies know exactly what they want. We had a conveyor belt of companies who came in with very specific and aggressive pitches about exactly what we should do and how we should do it. And we, with our team of public servants, have to take all that and come up with a regulatory frame that complies with the letter and spirit of the law, and also can sustain the scrutiny that these decisions reach. The decisions that countries have throughout Africa is actually a lot. It's similar, but it's even more complex. It's more complicated, where you're having to make first of a kind decisions, and in some cases for the country, it will be the only of a kind decision that shapes the future of the country. So how do you think about that capacity building? And then speaking the language, conversion tables, acronyms, definitions. How do you help facilitate that discussion? So just a couple of quick slides before we get to our final conclusion. So both supply and market opportunities. We had participants from Tanzania. We had participants from Mozambique on the supply side, but we also had participants from South Africa who are potentially suppliers and markets for natural gas, and participants from Ghana who also are potential suppliers and users of natural gas. When I was at Chevron in my previous career, I worked on the West Africa gas pipeline that goes from Nigeria to Ghana. And Ghana, interestingly, is now looking at importing LNG. And we had participants in our process from both Nigeria and Ghana, divergent views on what's really going on in terms of the two ends of that pipeline. But real kind of complex challenges here in terms of who's going to be supplying, who's going to be using. But as we look at the global picture for LNG, a real topic here around, at what point will markets go back into realignment? So, a conclusion now that markets certainly are oversupplied as not only U.S. LNG comes into the market, but you have other mega projects that are coming into the market. But at what point does this oversupply start to flip so that you can get new projects and get new gas into the market? The existence of markets within Africa can have an impact on this picture. So the work that countries are doing actually impacts the market scenario that they're trying to predict. And then finally, the gas power chain is complex, everything from gas production all the way through domestic consumers, and there are a lot of pieces there. Cycling right back to our earlier conversation, what are the different project structures and what are the driving factors that one would have to think about if one's making a decision about how do I enable and allow a company to get the final investment decision to develop your particular sovereign resources. So this slide is pretty much the heart of the book. It's the heart of the thought process that the team went through, and will be kind of the center of future workshops that we do together between the Department of Energy and governments throughout the region as they dig deeper into each of these various topics. So we did have a presentation of findings in December in Nairobi in Kenya, in which we talked about some of these issues. There are going to be additional discussions that we have, both here in the United States with companies, but also throughout the continent. That is going to, again, further develop some of the threads that we started to introduce in the handbook. So this is a photo from when we were in Nairobi just a few weeks ago, and this was at an event. So the gentleman there to my right is Charles Keter, who's the minister, the energy minister there in Kenya. And this was a last mile event. So they're doing some really innovative things there in Kenya, where they're making big efforts to push transmission out to communities that historically have not had access to electricity. And they're having some really big successes in terms of increasing the number of people who have access to electricity, which is really a core part of why this is part of the Power Africa initiative. Interested in not only developing these projects so that it can, for energy security in the world and to bring in foreign revenue for the countries, but also to make sure that natural gas does get to the domestic markets and it is driving power generation and it's helping people get access to electricity. So this was an event that I had the privilege of participating in with the minister, and this is before we went into one of the houses, and they kind of showed us the new technologies that they're using to get consumers connected. And you can't really tell in this photo, but there's kind of a dance going on here, and there's like a kind of shuffle line dance going on. So the minister grabbed me and said, "Oh, come on up, we have to dance with these ladies." So I look marginally less ridiculous now because it's not a video, right? You can't really see that I'm kind of trying to figure out what's going on. But this really drove home for me the fact of some of the useful things that governments are doing. This was a tweet that the minister sent out a couple days later of us, in one of the houses. And what they've done here is they've got a metering system. So a lot of folks don't have access to bank accounts, but people do have cell phones. And you use your cell phone to get a code back, just like many of us use for our two-factor authentication. You use that code to punch it into the wall, and that's what I've got my hand on here. And you put that code into the wall, and you've prepaid a unit of electricity. And there's a meter on there, and you can see exactly how much you've got left. And when you put the code in, your light comes on. And when you use up all the time, the light goes off. And the important thing about this is that the prices that consumers pay for electricity in Africa can actually be very high. I mean, it's expensive. It's based on inefficient sources, the inefficient generators, the transmission systems in many cases need upgrading. But the price that you pay can be quite high. And what happens is if you have a community that you're trying to connect and you get connected and then you bill the person and someone has to come out and find you and then you have to figure out how to get payments made. Well, it's a really inefficient way of billing for electricity. What this is it's pay-as-you-go. And what it means is that you can actually create some business models that are much more financeable, that have the virtue of getting electricity to communities that otherwise wouldn't have access to electricity, because you have a more efficient way of ensuring that people have a way to pay as you go along. And there's a virtuous cycle to be gained there as efficiency goes up, as productivity is increased, and as we're in one of these houses, the minister asked the woman to show me the kerosene lamp that she was using before. She said, "Oh, I already threw that away." Right? There was so much interest in what the government is doing here, and what the local officials were accomplishing. And again, I think the thing that we're doing here with this initiative to say, well, how can we help governments get big projects final investment decision? It's all about energy security and security period. It's about regulatory reform, and it's about transparency. It's about increasing the quality of life. But it's also about making sure that those molecules are getting to power generation, that generation is getting to people, and that electricity is impacting the way that the communities operate. So with that, I'll pause. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to roll this out here today, and look forward to some of the other comments.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Chris. Why don't we, go ahead. Very delayed. That was really, really helpful, and I just want to swear all of you to secrecy, even though this is being webcast and totally on the record, about the book sprint process, because I'm pretty sure Dr. Hamry, who runs CSIS, if he hears about it, we're all going to have to try one. And it sounds really great, but a little terrifying as well.
It is terrifying.
Sean, why don't we go to you next? Talk a little bit about how this fits into Power Africa and your broader agenda.
Thank you.
You just hit down.
Just hit down. Well, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm going to pick up on a few themes that Chris touched on. I think it just dovetails pretty nicely with this opportunity that I've been given to toot the horn of the American taxpayer, but also all of our partners and friends around the world who are interested in energy access in sub-Saharan Africa. So Power Africa, I'm going to give a bit of a high-level overview of what is Power Africa. CSIS has had a few sessions on it over the past several years. I watched a 2013 session last night, again, just to refresh my memory about all those questions everybody had 3.5, 4 years ago about Power Africa. And I hope that we'll be able to touch on a few of those today, and then I'll dig right into what we think our role and our capacity is in the LNG sector. So obviously, Power Africa is a response to a dramatic and tremendous need for energy access in sub-Saharan Africa. Two out of three Africans lack access to a source of electricity. McKinsey and Associates indicates, McKinsey and Company says that their analysis indicates that there's about an $835 billion deficit in sub-Saharan Africa for energy infrastructure in order to get that 600 plus million people some connection to an energy source. And then from an international standpoint, from a US government standpoint, from a development perspective, there is a tremendous need for something like Power Africa, for an amalgamation of efforts, a coordination of efforts in sub-Saharan Africa to bring energy access that will have impact and create gains in things like healthcare and education, governance even, providing services to citizens in some of the most underserved communities throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So there is that opportunity we've found about 3.5, 4 years ago when people in the US Congress and in the White House started getting together, having disparate conversations about the needs of sub-Saharan Africa and what are some of the common threads. Those conversations all led to electricity and the access to electricity on the African continent. It is now, almost 4 years later, we have seen tremendous international momentum in this sector. I would dare to say that there has not been in the history of sub-Saharan Africa the kind of momentum that we see now focused on Africa's energy sector in terms of interest in investing, interest in setting up permanent representative offices in these countries in terms of helping with these countries' development agendas. And it is, of course, access to electricity is a gateway to broader development outcomes, as I mentioned earlier. The U.S. can play a catalytic, and I think has played a very catalytic role in bringing together a number of actors. Not only have we, the U.S. government, come together, there are 12 U.S. government agencies that are involved in Power Africa. I'm a USAID employee, but I don't represent USAID necessarily. I represent the entire whole of government effort that is focused on bringing electricity to sub-Saharan Africa. And we've also been able to bring other countries, their money, their resources, their tools. Over 130 private companies now are part of the Power Africa network and family, and the multilateral institutions as well, and all their tools and capabilities. Obviously, the regional integration aspect, the business opportunities, and the creation of U.S. jobs can't be understated. We are seeing now, 3.5, 4 years later, we are now seeing signs of deals that were done in Africa having an impact in the communities and the towns here in the United States where turbines are manufactured or lawyers are discussing policy initiatives, or banks are putting together financing packages for deals in Africa. And then I'd be really remiss in highlighting the importance of bipartisan support in this city for Power Africa. It was ultimately a meeting of the minds between some real thinkers in the White House and some really proactive and progressive colleagues on the Hill from both parties to really come together and identify that this was a need, that this was an area in which the U.S. government should be investing for our national security, for development in Africa, and a whole host of other outcomes. So the model, what we've come to now is the result of that problem statement, those opportunities that we've identified. We came together as a U.S. government and we started thinking, how can we do development? How can we do promotion and transaction assistance a little bit differently than we've done in the past? And I think what Power Africa brings to the table is a true public-private partnership. This is not necessarily what the U.S. government or other donors have done in Africa, or even host governments have done in Africa in the decades past. This is following market signals. This is asking companies, where are you interested in investing and how can we facilitate that investment? Is there something we can do to help change that policy or that regulation that would allow you and all of their partners to come together and reach a final negotiation on a deal? So what I think it represents, that kind of package, it's a long-term commitment by the U.S. government. We are looking at providing assistance under Power Africa, hopefully through at least 2030. Our targets of 60 million business and household connections plus 30,000 megawatts of generation capacity is substantial. It will take until 2030, maybe even beyond, to meet those targets. As I mentioned, we are following market forces. If it's not investment worthy, Power Africa won't be there to provide assistance. That's really important. There's no forcing a project down the throats of a government or a community or a region. This is following the signals that parties have already come together to start discussing and negotiating and working on a deal together. As I mentioned, it is a whole of government effort for the United States. It is a diverse array of partnerships. Power Africa is built on the power of its partnerships and the relationships that network has created. And then, of course, it increases the amount of accountability that local government officials and central government officials have in actually providing an environment that's worthy of investment and will attract the billions of dollars out there that are ready to invest in Africa's power sector. This is just a quick snapshot of a lot of those partnerships that we talk about, and there are, of course, many, many more. I will draw your attention to in the sort of the middle. There are 2/3 down on the right-hand side. Though all those flags are actually countries that have committed either their funds or their government, the tools that their government has, to the goals of Power Africa. So in some cases, we walk side by side and we sit at the same tables with a Swedish counterpart, or Japan takes the lead in providing assistance on a particular negotiation, or the British government might look at its financing mechanisms to facilitate a transaction. These are very powerful when you bring all of these actors together. And what this partnership aspect has done is it has resulted in a commitment now that's actually going up pretty much every month now, but the commitment now is of $54 billion of investments in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, that's commitments, and a lot of those funds are targeted towards some really key infrastructure programs throughout the continent. I mentioned the toolbox. So what is different about Power Africa is that there's very little direct funding. We facilitate. We bring parties together. We ensure that in order to get a deal across the finish line or to financial close, that we have all the right parties around the table to make that happen. So our tools seek to, again, to facilitate individual transactions, and we follow the market in order to identify those transactions. We're helping reduce the investment risk that exists for whether it's a country or it's a private actor or it's a multilateral institution. We're removing the hurdles that exist, whether they're financing or regulatory or land issues. We're helping to resolve those, make sure that all the right parties are sitting down at the table to have those discussions. And then, of course, I think the longer-term aspect is all of the legal and policy and regulatory reforms that occur under the rubric of an energy transaction help to facilitate private sector investments in the future in these countries. Progress to date, so we're very proud of the fact that just about 3.5 years into Power Africa, we now have about 5,500 megawatts of generation capacity that we have seen financial close of transaction. About 1,000 of those megawatts are actually up and running now. 70% of that 5,500 megawatts is in the natural gas sector. So you'll see, and I'll talk a little bit more later, the gas sector is extremely important not only to Africa's future, but also to all the network that makes up Power Africa. And as I said, 5,500 is only about 18% of our target of 30,000 megawatts. So we are still tracking upwards of 70,000 megawatts of deals throughout the continent and seeing which ones are appropriate for providing assistance, investments, bringing people down to the right table. We have over 3 million new household and business connections, which totals to be about 15 million people. There are a host of very deep and profound policy and regulatory reforms that are in some level of development around the continent so that other transactions and other deals can happen. And then, as I mentioned before, we have seen really, because of Power Africa and other similar initiatives around the world, we now see an unprecedented momentum of interest in investing in sub-Saharan Africa's energy sector. So in what's really important about this past year is the U.S. Congress's passage of the Electrify Africa Act. And I would be remiss to not call out my colleague sitting close to the front row here, who was an instrumental part of that process, Nomini Rubin. It's absolutely a critical part of thinking through with her colleagues all of the necessary policy framework for the U.S. government to keep providing assistance in this area over the long term. It's that long-term commitment that has created that environment where people actually do want to partner for a reasonable period of time to make things happen. We see that as part of that law, there's a special call out for that Power Africa and the U.S. government will consider technologies, all of the above technologies in Africa. What that means is Power Africa is not just focused on solar and gas or coal or biomass or wind, that we actually consider all of the above when we're thinking about providing assistance. We, meaning the network of partners, thinking about providing assistance to a transaction in Africa. And so natural gas, obviously, is a really important technology in this area. Again, it's about 70% of the megawatts that we've seen the financial close at this point. It is absolutely critical to Africa's future. We focus on developing both the local resources as well as the external resources that could be imported into a country. And I think Chris did a great job of kind of explaining that value chain as well. I think we might borrow that graph or that picture. And then the natural gas master plans. We are providing assistance to many countries to develop master plans that help a sector start off right in a country. Make sure that all the voices that need to be heard, all the people who need to be sitting at a table are there and talking about the different challenges and how to address them. What we've done to date, obviously we are absolutely ecstatic about the Department of Energy's leadership and effort to bring to put together and publish the LNG handbook that we are celebrating today. But we're also, throughout the continent, we have a team of transaction advisors that are running around capitals and economic capitals and political capitals of sub-Saharan Africa to pull together transactions to make sure all the players are talking together to promote policy reforms that would help something move forward. Reverse trade missions. Particularly in the gas sector, what we've seen is colleagues from Africa come over to the United States to meet some of their counterparts, whether they're in the government or in the private sector or in financing institutions, to come over here, learn more about the gas sector, and then bring those lessons back home and start putting deals together. And then, of course, our contribution today, we've done some pretty large utility-scale gas projects to date. But we've also been focusing quite a bit on rehabilitating old facilities to ensure that that some efficiencies that could be gained from those existing facilities can be brought, that power can be brought into the grid. And then looking forward, we see gas as a growth market in sub-Saharan Africa. It is not only we're focused on increasing the efficiencies of existing infrastructure, but we're also trying to help countries pull together what we would view as competitive procurements, and as well as to look at the necessary infrastructure, both for ports, gas pipelines, whatever it might be, that's absolutely necessary to bring those gas-fired megawatts online in a given country. And then increasing the partnerships around the gas value chain. We are always looking for new partners. Again, the strength of Power Africa is because of the partnership network that we have created. It's not in any one individual, any one company, or any one institution that's a part of it. So thank you very much. This has been a terrific opportunity. And again, this is just we are so proud of the development of this LNG handbook, and look forward to your questions a little bit later. So thank you.
Skipped up the traffic cop to get you not falling off the stage. So we've got about a half hour left for discussion and presentation. What we thought we would do is turn to Angelina LaRose and then Jennifer Cooke to talk a little bit about, we've heard from Chris and Sean about what the purpose of the handbook is and how it fits into the Power Africa structure. But now to talk a little bit about, the markets and the sort of political context in which we're trying to develop these opportunities, I think it would be good to have a little bit of a presentation from Angelina and then here's from Jennifer.
Yes, so I was going to speak just for a few minutes about the broader context of where EIA is seeing the global natural gas markets. I'm going to focus both on our projections as published in the International Energy Outlook as well as the Annual Energy Outlook, as in addition to some of the things that we're seeing going on in the market today that will have a greater impact. So as Sarah mentioned, this is kind of a broader type of overview. So I wanted to start off just by showing what our projections are for world energy consumption as a whole by fuel. So we have energy consumption within our projections. This is from the reference case of our International Energy Outlook, which was published in May. We have consumption across the different fuel types growing through 2040. And despite the strong growth in renewables, as well as some growth in nuclear, fossil fuels will make up over 3/4 of the energy consumed in 2040. Natural gas is the strongest growing fossil fuel, growing at about 1.9% per year. And this is owing largely to the very abundant resources of natural gas, as well as the production of those resources from shale and tight plays. So just taking a look at history, this is a graph showing 2010 and 2015 LNG imports. The Asia-Pacific region makes up about 1/3 of global natural gas trade in its entirety, both pipeline and LNG, but accounts for over 3/4 of LNG trade in itself. So clearly very heavily reliant on imports of LNG. We are seeing growth over the last several years within those markets, particularly from Japan, Korea, as well as China and India. One of the things that we've seen both within those markets, kind of something interesting that's been developing the last several years, is whereas LNG contracts are historically tied to oil and are long-term contracts, we're seeing short and spot contracts develop. And for example, in Asia in 2015, about 1/4 of the LNG imports were delivered on these shorter term contracts, which is something much different than we saw even 5 years ago. Another development that we're seeing that's influencing the market today, as well as where we see it going in the future, is we're seeing a development of a lot of smaller importing areas and using floating gasification infrastructure to become LNG importers. We're seeing that in 2015 in Egypt and Pakistan, as well as Jordan. They brought on this type of infrastructure, and there's been interest in bringing that similar infrastructure on in Latin America last year as well as this year. So we're seeing not just one large LNG importing country come on board. We're seeing a lot of these smaller countries that are using floating gasification as a cost-effective solution to account for their very seasonal demand. So we're expecting LNG to double within our projection period. Similar to what Chris showed in his presentation, we are showing in the short to medium term somewhat of a loose market. And EIA is projecting that the market will tighten in the mid-2020s, which I think is your realignment case one that you showed, or similar to that. In terms of why we're seeing some slackening LNG demand growth, this is coming from slower growth in the Asian Pacific region, as well as in Europe. We're seeing a slowdown in natural gas being used, consumed for electric power generation, in addition to pipeline imports in Europe, creating more of a gas-on-gas competitive environment. So in terms of supply, we do have a lot of supply coming online in the next several years. We have liquefaction capacity increasing by about 30% through 2019 from the 2015 base. Over 90% of this new capacity is coming from the United States, as well as Australia. EIA is anticipating that Australia will overtake Qatar as the largest LNG exporter in the world by 2019. So this is the last slide I wanted to share, and this is from our annual energy outlook that was just released a couple weeks ago. One of the things that I always caution people when they're looking at our projections that EIA produces, both in the AO and the IO, is how important it is to kind of keep in mind what our assumptions are, as well as look at the reference case in context to our side cases that kind of capture the uncertainty inherent in projecting energy markets out 25 years. LNG, our projections, so this is the graph on the left is the projections of US LNG from domestically sourced. In our reference case scenario, we have about 12 BCF per day of exports coming online. EIA, how we consider the market and how we model the market, is that global natural gas prices, so LNG prices, will remain linked to oil prices to some degree throughout the projection period. And they're also very highly sensitive, clearly, to what our domestic prices are. So what this graph is showing is in a high and low oil price case, how vastly different the economics of exporting LNG within our model would be. So in a high oil price case where oil prices top about $225, which makes the what we have the competing price of LNG for U.S. LNG manufacturers be much higher. We have close to 25 BCF per day of LNG, but if oil prices, if we remain in a very low oil price environment for the next 25 years, you can see we only have a little above 2 BCF per day of exports. So there's a lot of uncertainty within this market, and I think that's really what I'm trying to show in this slide. So thank you.
Thank you, Angelina.
Thanks, and great presentations all around. First of all, let me say I read the handbook, and I'm not an energy expert, but it's very readable, very understandable and concise and clear, and I think it's going to be extremely helpful, not only for governments, but equally important, I think, to legislators in Africa, to civil society will be, and media who will have to hold governments to account, and in universities, and I think this is true of all the understanding series, to universities that are trying to build a cadre of kind of well-informed decision makers and policy makers of the future in Africa. So it's great. At the end of 2014, as Sarah said, we, with the energy program, produced this report, Africa's New Energy Producers, Making the Most of Emerging Opportunities. It came shortly, not too long after the big finds in Mozambique and Tanzania, oil finds in exploration in Kenya, possibly off the shore of Liberia, Mauritania, Sierra Leone, fairly recently after Ghana came on stream, and there was a huge amount of exuberance and hope at that moment that this could be transformative to Africa. Standard Bank at that time estimated that by 2030, $1.3 trillion in investment into the energy sector would be forthcoming. A lot of excitement about the kind of the training, the tech transfer, the infrastructures for the energy sector, deep water ports, roads, pipelines, and so forth that serve the energy sector, but also would have knock-on effects into the broader economy. And not to mention kind of the driver that those revenues eventually could provide for economic diversification into industries like ag and manufacturing that can actually kind of boost employment, which is so critical in Africa. At that point, Tanzania's growth in July 2014 was 10.1. Mozambique's was 9.1. They were both recent MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation, compact recipients. Things were looking very good at that moment. But I think throughout this, our point was to say this is an opportunity, but it's not a guarantee. And there's a whole lot of things, even at that moment of kind of a lot of exuberance and excitement, and we were just starting to see oil prices decline, of the possibilities of this, but if the governments kind of get it right, and that was a big question. As I said, the market risk factor was starting to come into play as you saw oil prices continuing to decline and uncertainty around natural gas. So kind of the timeline for some of these benefits accruing would expand, and eventually the idea is that those resources will be developed, even if it's on a longer time span. But I think we have to be also very cautious, and I think the handbook is very helpful because it's very sobering as well, and I think an important reality check for a lot of those governments that are looking at these resources. The advent of those resources raised expectations phenomenally high in the public, among governments as well, and many of them, I think, well, Tanzania and Mozambique, for example, kind of counted their chickens before they hatched. We know the story of in Mozambique, the government kind of accruing $1.6 billion in debt, which it tried to hide from the IMF with the expectation that it would be able to pay off the loan eventually through new revenues coming in, which haven't materialized. I think the two big players, Tanzania and Mozambique, are problematic, and I think the advent of this possible windfall has kind of exacerbated things to an extent. The stakes are much higher from government. You've really seen a rollback in kind of democratic norms in Tanzania, crackdown on opposition, on media, kind of much more, Tanzania has never been particularly open to private industry, but I think there's been a number of instances where the new president has kind of adapted a state-led approach. Tanzanian government reneged on agreement with Symbian on a government purchase agreement, which was a huge blow, not only for Symbian, and Symbian had the signature, but also for kind of potential investors looking into Tanzania. So the political risk there is I think, deepening. And in Mozambique, both of these have been essentially one-party states. You're seeing a low-level civil conflict between Frelimo and its longtime nemesis, Renamo. And in the midst of a massive food crisis and government mismanagement of kind of extremely controversial divides within the ruling party. And all of these things, when you look at how the long timeline that it will require to eventually realize the benefits of natural gas development and attract investors, make it all the more difficult. The market risks make it even more important for these governments to be competitive and be attractive to investors. The trade-offs on local content, on domestic use versus export, all of those become more fraught, but the political risks of this become, I think, are worrying. And none of this can work unless you have the commitment from the partner governments. Just a word to close on Power Africa, because I think it's been an incredibly important initiative, not only for what it's accomplished, but for kind of galvanizing a global push on this and being part of that. It has strong bipartisan support. It pretty much checks the boxes on whatever angle you want to come in on Africa, whether it's the health and education angle, whether it's the employment angle, whether it's the trade and commercial. I mean, number one barrier to U.S. investment that's cited by U.S. companies is the electricity deficit and the lack of affordable, reliable energy. So it hits all of those things, and I think it's important to cling on to these bipartisan things as we head into a new administration and really make that case, and you can make it on multiple fronts. It is kind of it has a tough road to go. Immediately as it launches, you have the drop in oil prices, and all these timelines get stretched out much longer than anticipated. I think Power Africa has done a very good job in kind of bringing long, lingering transactions to financial close. There's often a gap between financial close and something getting done is one thing, but also, and I'd be interested to know if there's been more difficulty in kind of generating those kinds of transactions, if there are enough within the pipeline at a time when the markets are so uncertain. As I said, I think it's something I think that the new administration should want to take up, and I think there's a strong case to be made for it, but it depends a great deal on what partner governments are willing to do about it. I'm much more optimistic about the Ghanas, which have just had a kind of successful transition of power from one party to the other. Democracy's good, but also what that does is put the pressure on the new administration to deliver and perform, because you're starting to see kind of performance-based voting rather than some other thing. In Cote d'Ivoire as well, Kenya is getting its act together on energy dating back 15 years. They've really had a strategic focus on this. But for those like Mozambique and Tanzania that are kind of doing all of this on the fly, having to go back and retrofit some of the legislation and the regulations, kind of buffeted by multiple competing interests and elites, I think it's going to be a much more difficult road. than I had originally anticipated in the 2014 report.
That's great.
So sorry to throw a wet blanket, but
No, it gets turnabout is fair play because Jennifer's being polite. But when we were working on the report, we find that countries and companies are very excited when they find something or when prices are very high. And it's sort of a process we go through in the oil and gas sector time and time again. And during the first round of the large sort of natural gas finds in East Africa in particular, you saw the overarching market dynamics, the impending price fall, what was happening with GDP growth, and there was a real question about whether or not those deals were going to be done and whether or not we had a real rational, clear-eyed view of what it would take to do those deals and what it would take to actually have all of the infrastructure, both financial and physical infrastructure in place to be able to connect those markets. And in an odd way, understanding that they present opportunities, but they're not guaranteed opportunities in a low oil price environment where the outlook for economic growth is actually much smaller and slower over a period of time, gives some breathing space to appreciate all of the difficulty, both from a government side and a commercial side, about how much you have to actually want to have those markets take place. So we had a workshop here not too long ago which was called Natural Gas Without an Advocate. And one of the reasons we did it and called it that was, people look at sort of an increment of expected demand and assume that it will be filled with, or try to, come up with scenarios that'll be filled with a particular fuel or a particular set of deals or that sort of thing. And you actually, especially in this environment, especially in a place like Africa, have to advocate for those things to get done. You have to create those markets. And that takes a lot of work. And so I want to open this up for conversation, but before I do, I'm just going to pose one last sort of question to the panel, and please, answer quickly so we can get to the audience's questions. But given that these markets are not guaranteed solutions, and even though you have focused on deals or investment opportunities that are not, especially, for you, Sean, that are investment worthy, what is either for Chris and Sean, what is the role that you see for these projects that you've been working on going forward for enabling those things to get done? And then maybe for Angelina and Jennifer, what is it that you look for when you're analyzing a market or a company that show you, or a country, excuse me, that show you that there is actually that long-term commitment to creating that opportunity? What would change your outlook or change your view? Chris?
Well, that's an enormous question because there's obviously a lot to that. But governments they have to lean into this issue of transparency and regulatory reform. There has to be an understanding of what attracts investment. I mean, it's as we saw in some of the slides, and as you look at for example, the oversupply of natural gas and LNG, it's a difficult market. And so governments have to understand, well, what is it that it takes to demonstrate to an investor that this is an environment in which we've got the right transparency and the right regulatory reform and the right rule of law, that not only can a company make a return on its investment, but also we're thinking about the long-term interests of the people who live in the country in such a way that that deal is going to be sustainable, that it's going to have a decadal life, which you need to move forward. A second thing to think about is, well, the business models and technologies are constantly changing. There are different ways of alleviating some of this above-ground risk, some of the sovereign risk. Large-scale versus smaller-scale projects, floating solutions. As we talked about on the power sector, using technology to ensure that there's a more reliable way of increasing the percentage of people who actually pay for the service that they're consuming in terms of power generation. So governments that kind of look at the evolving commercial markets and the evolving technologies that increase the creditworthiness and reliability of projects are going to be those governments that are going to be more successful at getting projects to final investment decision.
I think that's right, and so I'll tackle your question, but also add a little bit that will answer your question, Jennifer. I think the role that Power Africa has played is, I think, the one that we can continue to play. Bringing the right actors to the same table to sit down with host governments donor actors, the multilateral institutions, private companies that we had no idea even existed, but that might add some value to a particular transaction. That is a particularly valuable role of the U.S. government and some of our other government partners from other countries. But I think overall, in an environment in which there's more uncertainty, particularly for, I would say, the larger transactions on the continent, the big infrastructure deals, they're hit by not only commodity price fluctuations, but also growing issues of land and environment, policy issues. I think what Power Africa will continue to focus on is ensuring that countries are focusing on the fundamentals, the policy reforms that make that environment attractive for the billions of dollars that are sitting in that country or offshore to invest in a particular project. I would also say that in a period like this, where, particularly looking at the oil and gas sector or even coal on the continent, is that there's opportunity for looking at the scale up of innovative approaches and technologies. We see a tremendous amount of interest and growth in the off-grid space, for instance, looking at household solar or microgrids being established between communities. These are tremendous opportunities that we feel that we're adding a lot of value at right now, bringing actors together in a particular country. And then I think also the U.S. government, I think the Department of Energy has done an amazing job at this, of promoting new technologies in the research institutions, private companies, both here and abroad, to be rolled out and brought to market in a place like Sub-Saharan Africa.
That's great. Thanks, Sean.
So when we're evaluating countries for our outlook, we look at a host of issues, many of which I guess everybody is considering. We're looking for a demonstrated commitment to long-term infrastructure in terms of how things in markets and countries are going to evolve, particularly as relating to final investment decisions, and other above-ground factors as well, such as what are the government's support, how are transparent markets supporting the evolution of the energy economy within a country, what is the ability for a country to apply technology transfer to things that they've learned even from, say, in the United States, how can that be applied elsewhere in the world? What is the geopolitical environment? That's something that we consider a lot of when we're doing our modeling. EIA is actually building several we're trying to develop our international modeling capabilities, and geopolitics is a huge part, and how do you capture that within a structured model? And we've hosted a lot of different workshops. It's all on our website, and I encourage everybody to kind of have a look if you're interested and provide us feedback. And lastly, we look and try to evaluate what is the room for economic growth that would support the demand for this energy infrastructure.
Great. Thanks, Angelina. Did you want to add anything?
Basically, a lot of what you said. I mean, on the commitment, it's important to have top leadership commitment and a commitment from the people who actually can get things done. Power generation is a priority for pretty much every African government, but how many are really willing to make the hard choices, the policy reforms, which are also often politically not palatable, like tariffs and so forth, to make it happen. That's one. The other is kind of at least a greater or lesser familiarity with the private sector and dealing with the private sector. You look at a place like Tanzania, where there's been kind of a long-standing distrust of private sector players. They're just here to make money. Well, yeah, that's what the private sector does. Versus a Kenya, which has always had a much more outward-looking economy dating pre-independence, and is much more kind of confident in dealing with external investors. And I think that confidence of governments is incredibly important, and the trust that they have with the other. Another, and I'm not an energy expert, but on a number of different issues I've looked at, kind of clear lines of responsibility within the institutional framework. You have so many competing interests on something like the energy sector or the ag sector, whatever it might be. If the lines of responsibility are not clear, if there's not a senior leader champion that can push with backing from the top leadership, you're very likely to have kind of a hodgepodge of policies rather than a clear kind of policy, integrated and comprehensive policy environment. Governments will often go for the quick win versus looking at the longer term picture where a whole lot of components need to come together. So
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, we're running tight on time, so I'm going to take a few questions together. Please raise your hand, state your name and affiliation and question in the form of a question. Right over here first, and then we'll kind of come across.
Hi, thank you very much for the panel. My name is Amaka, and I work with Eurasia Group covering West Africa. My question is about, so I know everybody has talked about how much bipartisan support it has, but we know that the bulk of financing for it is scheduled to go through EXIM, which doesn't have that much bipartisan support, and particularly with the requirement for board approval for financing over $10 million. I'm curious as to sort of how that affects the future of Power Africa, because my sense is that a lot of the financing you need needs to be over $10 million for these kinds of sort of large-scale projects. So what does that mean for, I think it's 6 out of the 7 million is supposed to come through Exxon. What does that mean for Power Africa, and what's your, I guess, outlook with the new administration? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, is there another one right in here? Right here, sir.
Francois Hinchel, South African Embassy, and my question relates to the question just before me. Well, firstly, thank you very much for the CSIS for hosting this. Secondly, also to the DOE for the handbook. You know, my country, we had representatives there, and thank you so much. It's a valuable resource. It's been sent down to South Africa. But a general question. Under Power Africa, South Africa has gained significant advantage. There's been significant support from Power Africa for both coal-fired power stations as well as renewables in South Africa, successful projects funded. OPEC, EXIM, both played a critical role. We are in a dynamic environment, new policy space that's going forward. Same question as she had. We have questions about the future of Power Africa. We have specifically the future about the policy being followed in the US, and how do you see that? It's specifically a question to Chris and Sean. I know it's difficult to predict, but we are looking at 2 new gas-fired power stations. We're looking at funding. We've put out tenders. We need to know if there would be support from US actors, or should we look elsewhere? Thank you.
Okay. So 2 excellent questions. I'm going to go right here.
Well, thank you. Jeff Epping with Energis LLC. I actually have a fairly simple question for Sean. Is Power Africa active in the Maghreb or North Africa in general?
Okay, and then we'll go right over here to Andrew. Thank you for passing that down.
Hi, Andrew Dowdy, consultant. Just a quick question. It appears that in Africa there's a significant amount of resource, natural gas resource, either in small fields or particularly distributed gas reserves. I think of, say, the coal bed methane and the Karoo basins that stretch across wide swaths of South Africa, Southern Africa. None of these resources appear to be really, big pipeline worthy, or certainly not LNG project worthy. But even very small resources are incredibly significant for power generation for local population, including on mini grids. I'll give you an example. 100 MCF a day well, which would be a fairly crappy coal bed methane well, is enough gas for a city of 30,000 people, for the power for 30,000. It's pretty extraordinary. So I'm curious, has anybody been looking at this, including the business models, the different kind of business models that would be necessary to exploit this? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Oh, and we'll do one right here. You both have, okay, you gotta make them fast though. Go ahead.
My name is Peter with Bit360. My question is, first, thank you for the handbook. It's a pretty good resource, especially very nice and easy to read. It's it's obvious that a lot of the issues are on the affordability and on the predictability, but they are basically based from the production all the way to the distribution. My question is, did you guys have any discussion regarding the prior to the production, on the exploration and on the feasibility, any kind of solutions? And this would be for countries like Kenya who are still trying to figure out whether they actually have enough LNG to make it viable.
Make it viable, okay. And sir, did you have one too? Oh.
Hi, Manny Ikpo, good friend of this great organization. Appreciate your presentation. Question to both Chris and Sean is that, Chris, when you showed the map, I wondered how come Southern Sudan wasn't there. I thought there was a large risk capacity of natural gas in that area. Second question is, there are countries there that have large capacity of natural gas and have large LNG programs. For example, Nigeria. What do you think is the problem where they're still in dark since electricity was introduced in the country? What is the policy? How can we make it better so that any lessons learned from there can then be used to other countries?
Great. Okay, mostly for Chris and Sean, but Sean, do you want to take the XM and then Power Africa oriented ones? And
Sure. I was hoping, Chris, you take the XM one, but that's it.
Might as well.
It's because it's your last day. That would be a good one for you.
You want to ask me the day after my last day.
I'll take a couple of the questions. So XM is a valuable partner of the interagency of the Power Africa family. You're right that they do not have board quorum, and so therefore they do not sign off on, or they don't process transactions that are over $10 million. XM would, in a normal environment, have a tremendously powerful role in facilitating individual transactions in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think of particular value, I think American companies would have particular value in ensuring that either their products or some component of their work, whether it's a service or a thing that is being produced by Americans, would find its way into a transaction in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what I don't know is if that's necessarily having an impact at the end of the day yet. What we do believe is that there is a role for an organization like XM, certainly. Other actors are trying to identify tools and resources that could be used as a substitute for the loan products that XM brings to bear. I think if I can be so brave as to say that I think the aspect that is missing in that equation when other parties are trying to find solutions that XM would have otherwise provided is the absence of an American financing institution that helps American companies get into or invest in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's not, I can't say it's quantifiable, or at least I don't have data that would show how quantifiable all of that is, to be honest. A couple other things. Pre-feasibility studies. The U.S. government actually does have a host of grant-making tools that cover competitively. You can bid or you can solicit funds that cover the expenses associated with pre-feasibility studies and assessments. Other countries, including the Europeans, so the Europeans, the British, several other countries, actually there's quite a few of them, the Italians, have also grant mechanisms that companies and individuals and countries can apply for in order to cover the vast majority of expenses associated before something comes to financial close, when you're just developing the information associated with a possible transaction. Problems in Nigeria. So Nigeria is a absolute gold mine, if you will, in terms of the possibilities that exist to provide energy for all of its citizens. I think that the easiest, I could write a paper on this, probably the crowdsourcing book, yeah. Right now we could do that, but I think the easiest response is that to date, policies and regulations and processes, so regulatory processes in the energy sector, have not been developed such that they create an environment whereby private companies can expect a return on their investments. And that continues to be a challenge for the Nigerian government, and maybe one of my colleagues want to go into more detail on that. I will comment on the the colleague from South Africa on the future of Power Africa. So I won't speculate about what the incoming administration has in mind for Power Africa. What we do have is we have a law that was passed unanimously in the beginning of 2016 that it creates a framework and gives the marching orders for the U.S. government to consider this a foreign policy and assistance priority for the U.S. government. That law is unchanged, and while that law doesn't necessarily come with funds, what we do believe is that there is enough momentum. There are so many things going on in Africa now that it's to the benefit in terms of U.S. foreign policy. It's to the benefit of all of our partners and allies around the world and American companies to continue to invest, whether it's in Power Africa or something like Power Africa moving forward. So why don't I stop there?
That's
I
great.
don't wanna go too
Yeah.
So I'll build on a couple of those issues. So there's a lot to be learned from projects that are well underway, or in some cases have had some challenges. I mean, we've got the major LNG project in Angola that has had major challenges, delays, setbacks. There's some unique things about that project. I mean, it's utilizing associated gas, which creates some commercial and technical complexities. But there have just been some real problems in the way that plant's been designed and constructed, and there are things to be learned from that. Likewise, in Nigeria, I mean, you're not seeing the penetration in some cases of access to electricity that you would hope would come with these major gas development projects. I love the expression of the gold mine of possibilities. I think was the way you kind of expressed it, which is the positive spin on some of the challenges there. But at the same time, as we look at perhaps models that haven't always led to the efficient utilization of gas for the benefit of the people in the country, there are things to be learned from that as countries on the east coast of Africa look at trying to structure and create these projects in a way that does create the right type of benefits. And in my comments, I mentioned just briefly that I'd worked on that West Africa gas pipeline that goes from Nigeria to Ghana, which now you're looking at in Ghana the potential of doing a floating LNG to import natural gas as LNG when there's a pipeline. I mean, there is a pipeline in place, right there. And there's lots of discussion around, is the problem the offtake side on the Ghanaian side, is the problem the reliability of the gas on the Nigerian side, and you'll get conflicting answers there. But that dotted line on the map, a border is a powerful thing, and these projects that cross borders do have some additional complexity. So the map that I showed was the product that came out of the group that managed the book sprint. It's not intended to be comprehensive. There are other gas opportunities. A gentleman mentioned South Sudan not being included. There are others that didn't show up on the map. But in terms of size of the prospect, one of the important things as you're thinking about what commercial model are we going to follow is, what is the size of the opportunity and what's the size of the investment that we think we can attract into the country. So everything from the very, very large multi-billion-dollar mega projects down to the much smaller and in some cases perhaps floating projects or things that are going to be that we encourage governments to consider, like what is the right scale so that your timing is appropriate, so that you can start the process. Most of the thinking that the group did engage in was really starting in production. There was some discussion of pre-production of exploration, but again, the the range of activities when you think about commercializing natural gas is very broad, and there's probably more to be said about the exploration phase. And the last thing I'll mention is that there's a tremendous opportunity to think about how smaller finds of natural gas can contribute to hybrid systems in a way that's been very different than power's been developed in other areas. We have this model here in the United States and in Europe that was based on the technologies that we had in the 1900s when you were first thinking about these things, which is, you dig a bunch of coal out of the ground, you put it in a giant mountain, you build boilers, you burn the coal, you make water hot, you turn a stem, you chop down a bunch of trees, you put power distribution lines across your country, and that's the way you electrify populations. And that is what you knew how to do when we were building, this infrastructure we have in the United States. As we think about bringing power to rural populations throughout Africa and other parts of the world, distributed power generation systems, hybrid systems that integrate wind and solar and baseload fossil using potentially natural gas are going to be attractive ways to bring supplies of energy to rural populations that right now don't have access to energy. And fortuitously, we'll have lower cost and a much lower greenhouse gas footprint. So there is, I think, a lot to be done around smaller finds. We looked at the bigger offshore stuff here in this particular handbook, but certainly smaller quantities of natural gas that gives you baseload power for hybrid systems that integrate renewables are going to be really important for distributed power generation systems in the future as you're trying to increase the percentage of people that have access to electricity.
Well, we've gone over time, and so I want to be respectful of your time and the audience's as well, but I just want to congratulate you guys and the whole team of people that you work with on putting out this really useful product and the other ones that you've put out as well. We're going to continue to talk about these issues of development of energy in Africa, but also the